So hello everyone, welcome. As I was saying, this is our third session out of 5 total for this machine learning primer workshop. Our focus today is going to be on sequential data and recurrent neural networks. So I'll start off by talking about sequential data and problem types that fall under that category, as well as spend the majority of this session talking about recurrent neural networks and somewhat how to use them, as well as ways that we can interpret them and different variations. Come on. Okay. Oh, whoops. As a reminder of what we covered in our previous sessions, our first session, we were looking at traditional data analysis methods. As we can see here, data decomposition, dimension reduction, such as PCA or principal component analysis, as well as some clustering methods. And then we went into a general introduction of sort of what the framework is for performing machine learning, how we sort of look at different data types and how that impacts how we might want to, what we might want to select for our modeling strategy, as well as what different objective functions or loss functions are for what you're trying to accomplish, and then how we might evaluate models. For the second session, we looked at what form those different machine learning methods might take. So we started with a brief survey of some classical methods such as regression, state vector machines, and then decision trees or random forests, before we went on to understanding what neural networks are and how they're trained. And in particular, we focused last time on what's called fully connected neural networks or feed-forward neural networks. The parts that we, or sort of the topics that we covered in previous sections that will be most relevant or that will sort of go into more detail today are going to be data types, not so much input labels, but data types, because we'll be looking more specifically at sequential data. And then we'll be introducing a new neural network structure and discussing how the training and gradient propagation can be a particular challenge when working with that type of structure and architecture. So for today, we're going to be looking at sequential data and problem types associated with sequential data. And then also be discussing sort of what are the general things that we need from a model in order to learn successfully on a sequence or on sequential data tasks. And then to answer some of that question, or one possible solution to that would fit these requirements is called recurrent neural networks. So we'll discuss their structure, how we set them up, as well as some of the challenges associated with using recurrent neural networks. We'll then go over some variations on RNN architectures, such as gated mechanisms or ones where the recurrent weight matrix will be constrained based on to enforce certain dynamics that you might want. And then we'll draw some sort of higher level connections with dynamical systems, as well as how they can translate, RNNs can translate to modeling and understanding biological systems. So I'll start here by going over what we mean by sequential data and giving some examples of what they might look like. So for example, we might have some kind of character prediction. So anyone who, if you're typing into Google or anything that has, or like any sort of autofill, when you start typing something, it might fill out what that is, or might fill out that phrase for you or that term for you. So that would be, some sort of sequential task there because it's text. Another one might be where you take an entire set of text in one language. So in this case, we have Persian, where we say "Hava emruz chetore," which would be the weather. What is the weather like today? So that would be another form of a sequential data in written form. We can also have audio. Audio recordings will be something that's also sequential data because it has a temporal component to it as well. So any sort of translation from some sort of audio into maybe auto captioning it, that would require a model that can perform sequential processing. And then another thing might be music transcription. So once again, you're taking audio and instead of putting text to it, you're then translating what the different notes are into some sort of score here. And then finally, we might have more complex data that has both a spatial component in addition to a temporal component. So that kind of thing might happen if you are working with, say, body capture data, where you have many different points on a body that you're trying to track and follow, not only in space, but also as it evolves in time. You might have weather modeling, which can be very complex in that it has dependence on where things were previously, as well as evolves within space. And then finally, probably most relevant to this group is that we have some, brain activity, which might have some dependence not only on, how things evolve in time, but where the different neurons are spatially related to each other might have some impact on the strength of the weights between them. So we'd want to have some way to learn both aspects of space and time there, which can be challenging. Some features of sequential data which distinguish it from other forms of data, particularly like vector data, are that, first of all, order matters. So if you were to take some sequence or something that happens over the course of time, if you were to mix that order up, it would lose a lot of its meaning, because the meaning of sequential data is very much dependent on the order in which things take place. Oftentimes with vectors, at least the interpretation of vectors is that dimensions tend not to have that same amount of sort of hierarchy to them. Sequences can also come in variable length. There are many problems in sequential data where maybe you want to simultaneously be able to process and make a prediction based on a sequence that is very short, as well as one that's very long. And to have a successful sequential model, it can be necessary for you to be able to process both of those with accuracy using the same sort of model and set of parameters. And then there is a temporal dependence, which is kind of related to both of these here, but previous values in the data set will have some impact on whatever your current value is. That's a general assumption in a sequence, in that, as we said, order matters. Now, there is some interesting problems that can come up there, where for different types of sequences, the duration over which that temporal dependence can extend can vary. So sometimes you only care about a short time span in order to impact what the current value is. Sometimes you need to understand what's going on and be able to track what's going on from many, many time steps before. So having that flexibility to learn short and long-term dependencies can be very important and necessary for a wide variety of tasks. But even within these concepts, or I guess there's another layer of complexity, even if your data is sequential, whether that's your input or output, where it can have a lot of variability in what exactly the role of the model is and how it relates to your input and output. So there's these general classification of problem types, where the first one here is one-to-one, which admittedly is a bit of a misnomer, because I call this sequential problem types, but one-to-one is the case where you actually don't have sequential input or sequential output. So this would not be most likely, like, this wouldn't really be a sequential problem, although you could argue there might be some cases where your model would treat it that way. But this would be like a standard problem type that would not have a sequential component. So examples might be things like image classification or like a regression problem. So in both of these cases, you don't really have a time aspect to it or some temporal component or a sequential aspect to it. You generally, you take one input, you're trying to get one output out of that. However, many problems, and the ones that we're concerned with today, do involve some sort of sequential aspect. So our second one here is going to be one-to-many, where we take in non-sequential data as our input, and then our output is in the form of a sequence. So what exactly that means here is that maybe that individual non-sequential data could be maybe some static prompt or static input that's used to generate some sequence as a result of that. So for example, we saw an image example before where we're just trying to do a classification, but if instead we're trying to do some sort of captioning. So I realize it's a little bit small on the screen here, but here we have an image of like some giraffes standing around. And so image captioning would be, our input is this image, but our output is a sequence, because we're trying to say what the words are that describe what's going on in that sequence. So it's different from a standard one-to-one, because it's not just a classification, it's a full-on description that requires a generation of text. Our other one could be something like music generation. So maybe we give some fixed prompt at first, which gives maybe an initial note or maybe a key, and then some prompt in terms of what the style is, or simply some general seed to start with. And then it would generate a sequence of notes in order to give you that music. And then on the flip side, then we'd have our many to one here, which is taking in our sequential input and then trying to give some non-sequential output. So an example there could be something like sentiment analysis. So this would be, say, you're looking at reviews on Yelp or Google that might not have a star rating associated with them. Or maybe you just take what the reading of the review is and you're trying to predict, was this a positive review, a neutral review, or a negative review? Or maybe you're trying to predict like what star rating they would give simply based on the text that they provided or the review that they wrote. So that would be sequential input because the text itself, as we described before, written input is sequential. And then our output would be just a single classification at the end. And then our final category here is going to be where both the input and the output are sequential. And this, while I only have two sort of images representing this, this actually has a very wide variety of things that we can vary. Oftentimes, this is because we go from a sequence to a sequence. You might sometimes hear these referred to as seek to seek. People in ML and AI love to abbreviate everything. But in this case, it's worth noting that while both the input and the output are sequences, they don't necessarily have to be sequences in the same space or like that are operating equal, like such that they're both the same length, or there might be an offset between them. So on the left one here, we have that we don't start providing an output or we don't start processing the output until a couple time steps have already occurred here. So you can have a lot of flexibility there. You might have completely different lengths. You might have provide an input sequence that has length like 100, and then maybe you're just trying to predict the next 5 time steps after that. That would be a seek to seek or a sequence to sequence, many to many task. But your input and output sequence would be very different sizes. They also could be different types though. So maybe you have some input sequence where maybe you are taking in an audio file that is of some style of classical music or some style of music of any kind, and your output might be, give me a description of this music in some way. That would be a sequential task to another sequential input to a sequential output. Even though they're both sequences, those are very different forms. So some examples that you might see here would be machine translation. So as I mentioned before, you might have a translation from one language to another. That's a sequence into another sequence. So you might have, like in English, you're saying, how are you? And then translating into French. Apparently you're speaking formally, so comment allez-vous? And then perhaps video captioning. So similar to the image captioning, except for a video, this actually does have a sequential and a time component. So you're describing the evolution of that video. And so a boy is playing golf here. That requires a sequential input and a sequential output. So given these different problem types and what form sequential data takes, it could be useful for us to understand what the requirements of a model would be in order to successfully be able to learn tasks on this type of data. So first, it's worth noting that as we've noticed, sequential data has the order matters. So if all we're doing is compressing into a vector form and then feeding it into our model, we're losing a lot of the value and a lot of the dependence that takes place and that is really importantly embedded in that sequence. So instead, can often be necessary, or it will be necessary in order to learn something in sequential form, to have it fed in as a sequence. So instead, each time step might be fed in individually in order to retain that. Now, that's not really something that the models that we talked about last week or 2 weeks ago with the fully connected feed-forward networks, they don't necessarily have that flexibility, and they're not really intended to work in that way. Another thing that can come up, as I've mentioned and sort of belabored a little bit over these last few slides, is that we need flexibility to whatever the length of our input or output sequence might be. So we want a model that can process both short and long sequences. So we might have some variety where, I guess I'm fixated on weather for all my examples right now, but we might be saying, okay, the weather is S. Well, what the model would trying to predict sort of what that final step might be. So its output might be sunny. So this is a relatively short sequence for an input and a relatively short sequence for the output. But let's say we're like, okay, we want that same model though to give us, given that context, what should we do? So you should remember to put on, well, hopefully, you should put on sunscreen so you don't burn. So you'd want the same model to be able to take in both the input and the output, or inputs of both of these sizes, and potentially have the capacity to output both of these lengths of output. And then finally, we need to be able to learn what that temporal dependence is and how far back we need to remember in order to successfully learn on a task. So I have like a schematic here from a paper that can just outline sort of different ways that you might have dependence. Sometimes you might just have a single dependence where each input or each step is only really dependent on the one right before that, or you might have some combination where you have things that are sort of independently many steps before contributing to it, or you might have some sort of like combination of them where there's another dependence there. So yeah, so it's important for us to be able to learn exactly what those relations are and how the previous time steps and however far back will be related. So this leads us to the type of model that we'll be focusing on here that fulfills these requirements, as we'll get into in a little bit, which are recurrent neural networks. So our setup here for a recurrent neural network is it will be processing an input, which is this X, an external input, using shared parameters A at each time step. And then it has an internal memory state variable, which we're calling this H of T, which is provided as an input as well to each step, as well as propagated as an output. So we can visualize this as you might call it like unrolling of this RNN. So we might have an initial time step where we have our first input of X0 leads to some sort of output of H0. And then that H0, in addition to maybe being given as an output and processed some other way, is once again fed back into that same network along with the next input in that sequence, which is then X1, which gives us an output H1, which then becomes the output for the next one, or the input for the next step with X2, and so forth. So that continues that at every step in time, we have the input from our external stimulus, which is this X of T, or external signal. Often that will be the data that you're actually trying to learn. And then this internal memory state variable H, or the hidden state is what we call it, which is why it's called H, from the previous time step, or the output from the previous time step. So as promised last time, when I put equations on the slide, I will do my best to go through them in detail so that we can understand exactly how the structure works. So I want to explore this in some good detail here. So the output of a cell back to itself is then going to be this hidden state H of T. It might have some additional an additional sort of layer that you associate after that processes this H of T to actually give whatever your prediction or your output might be, which is what this O of T is. So it's represented here by, well, we'll get into that in just a little bit here. And then really what this is doing is this is operating as a function on this X, this input X at some given time step T. And then it's taking this memory state as an additional input. So this HT, this input variable H, is then going to be multiplied. Oh, sorry, is also given as input in addition to this X. The hidden state is going to be multiplied by this W, because this W is being applied over and over to this hidden state, which is being evolved, but it sort of is recurrently applied, hence where recurrent neural networks come from. We call this W the recurrent weight matrix. And then the U, or sorry, this X is multiplied by the matrix U, which will be our input weight matrix. And then we have this additional bias, which is associated just a vector to give us our input to our hyperbolic tangent function, which we're writing as A. You might say A is like an argument, or sometimes you'll call that the activation. That A then gets fed into our hyperbolic tangent, as I said, to then give us this output h of t, which, as you can see, is falling to the right. This is what then is our memory variable that will get propagated forward to the next step. And then additionally, if we're doing some processing here on that output in order to get some prediction, you might want to introduce another matrix, which we're calling V here. This would be called the output matrix, output weight matrix, with some additional bias as well in order to get some prediction into our output sequence. So then as we propagate this forward, as we unroll these sequences or these cells in our RNN, that h of t output then becomes the h of t input to that next step, which then gets processed alongside our xt plus 1, giving us our final outputs of our ht plus 1 and then processed into our prediction of ot plus 1. So when we perform these sort of unraveling over long sequences, it can lead to, while it is a very powerful tool and is helpful, there are some interesting challenges that pop up when, especially when working on particularly long sequences. So some requirements that are necessary in order to learn things like this temporal dependence is we need to retain some degree of sensitivity to new input. So we can't have it where we've gone 100 steps and the 101st one literally makes no difference into our final outputs, because it can be important and necessary, and that's generally a requirement really to have a successfully learned on a sequence. But at the same time, we need to have the ability to retain old information in case there are those long temporal dependencies based on things that happened a long time ago. So if you're looking at maybe day-to-day data, you might want to be able to know, okay, what happened yesterday, what happened a week ago, what happened a month ago, what happened a whole year ago. Being able to operate on those different timescales can be necessary, but if you don't retain that old information, you have no ability to access that when making decisions going forward. And so this can lead to some major challenges when performing the gradient backpropagation that we discussed a little bit in the previous session. And that mostly comes from the fact that we're having an amplification of patterns and especially of functions, because we're composing the same function many times and operating recurrently. By operating that many times, that can lead to amplification of these issues. And so I have a little visualization here to give an idea of what that might look like, which is really inspired by or might look familiar to or based on sort of what we looked at with the singular value decompositions just like 2 sessions ago. So if we have this first direction 1, perhaps is one where we have an expansion along that direction in our hidden space. And direction 2 is one where we have some contraction taking place. So you can think of it where there's some information, there's some data that's being encoded in this hidden space, and the differences along that direction 1 are going to be spread out more, meaning that they're going to be amplified. Whereas ones in direction 2, because that direction is shrinking, it means that those 2 points are being put closer together. So each of these sort of has its own potential issue associated with it, because if the magnitude of differences early on gets continually expanded without really any bound, that could mean that as we get later in a sequence, we don't really have much sensitivity in that direction, because if something's been multiplied by 10, increased by 10% 100 times, but compounded every time, introducing some new difference that maybe is on the same scale as that original difference is not going to be understood or caught up on, because it's going to be drowned out by the accumulated differences over a long period of time. So that would be the challenge with direction 1. In direction 2, what that's saying is that any differences there will completely vanish, meaning that we aren't retaining any information there. So it can be challenging in ensuring that our model is actually identifying the correct directions to enhance, to retain, to maybe emphasize, or to get rid of. And that idea can really come down to an interpretation of what we call the eigenvalues. So anyone who's looked at who's studied linear algebra in the past, this might be familiar, but when we have a discrete time system, if we plot the eigenvalues in the real imaginary space, so in the complex plane, and we look at what the magnitude uh, of the eigenvalue is. If it is within this circle of 1, that means that overall there will be contraction in that space. Whereas if it's outside that circle, we'll have expansion in that space. So really that contraction corresponds to that direction 2 that we've been describing here, and expansion corresponds to direction 1. But you may have noticed then that there is a space here where we can have a neutral value. And based on the way I've been describing this before, instead of things being compressed significantly or expanded significantly over time, we can retain some of those differences if we're able to achieve functions that have these eigenvalues that are close to that value. And so there are ways that we can sort of enforce that and make it so that we retain that information. And while these aren't necessarily linear systems, so they aren't perfectly captured by eigenvalues, the intuition still remains for how we might accomplish this. So as I mentioned, this comes down to the fact that we have sort of uncontrolled gradients as well as composition of many functions over and over again with RNNs. So I have a visualization here which is intended to demonstrate how if we are trying to understand when we perform gradient backpropagation, what the contribution is to each to the loss at each step in time. If we sort of lose that sensitivity or we have this vanishing or exploding gradient, we really only have a small number of steps that we can actually perform that propagation for such that it has any meaning. So for our standard RNN, you can see that as we move backwards in time here, it effectively is saying it can only make any, because it goes gray here, it's saying it has no real distinction of what the contribution is as you move away from the very end of a sequence. However, by introducing some additional aspects here, as we'll go into soon with this LSTM, then we're able to retain that sensitivity much longer, which allows us to learn those longer sequences. So that's one way. These LSTMs are what we call a gated architecture. Another one is called GRU, which is just gated recurrent unit. And then another way we can do that is with what we call constrained weight RNNs or dynamically constrained RNNs. So I'll go into what those variants are in order to improve the stability of our RNNs. So as I said, that first one is this long short-term memory, or LSTM. So on the left-hand side there, this was just the model that we used before, the visualization for our vanilla RNN. You can see it's getting a little bit more complicated with our LSTM because we have some new features that we've introduced. The first of these features is this C of T. We call that the cell state. And then we have these 3 additional components here as well, which are what we call gates, which is why it's called a gated architecture. So the cell state here is something that is a unique feature introduced for LSTMs. And really the purpose of the cell state is to dedicate itself to accumulating the long-term memory of the model. Meanwhile, that H of T, which we call the hidden state, which was the only thing that we had in the vanilla RNNs, is dedicated instead to that short-term memory. So really functionally what it's trying to accomplish here, and why it's called LSTM, is that it has 2 different variables which are simultaneously tracking the long-term memory and the short-term memory of our system. The first gated component that comes up here is indicated by F, and that F is what we'll call the forget gate layer. And I'm not going to go into, I'll admit this one, I'm not going to go into as much detail on the individual components of the equations because they're all very similar. This is going to be a sigmoid function that goes from 0 to 1. For all of the gates, we're going to have those sigmoids, which are just telling you how much to keep and how much to get rid of. So for the forget gate, we this is telling us how much of this C we're going to end up retaining. Or in this case, you might say if it's less than 1, how much are we forgetting? The input gate is operating similarly, but instead on the input aspect with our short-term memory along with our input signal. I want to note that it interacts with our C tilde here of T, which if you remember the equation for our recurrent neural network, this is actually the same as the equation for the h of t at that point. So this is analogous to that, but now what we're saying is this input gate is telling how much of that of what our sort of vanilla RNN would output from this, how much of that are we going to end up keeping? And then once we've decided how much of the long-term memory we're forgetting and how much of that input from what would be the h of t from a vanilla RNN, how much of that are we keeping? We then combine the portion of the long-term memory that's remembered with the new input that comes from our x of t and our h of t minus 1. And then finally, we have our output gate. This is our final gate, which is just telling us how much of that long-term memory are we then going to partition aside to then be passed on for short-term memory at the next step. Yeah, so that's effectively how that works. So there are ways where this would be, certain certain values that can show up for these input and output and forget gates that make it the equivalent of a vanilla RNN. So if you have your forget gate is set to 0, your input gate is set to 1, and your output gate is set to 1, then that would mean that your output, your h of t, would get the same exact equation. So there is a way to recover the initial form, but this gives us more flexibility in order to learn these parameters that might help us determine those longer-term flexibilities and how much to emphasize short-term versus long-term memory. The other aspect or the other approach that we can take in order to improve the stability of our network is through what's called dynamics constrained architectures. So the idea behind this is that we're going to be constraining the weights of our recurrent weight matrix, which is this W here, in order to enforce a particular type of hidden state dynamics. So one example for this is going to be what's called antisymmetric RNNs. And the idea behind that is that we're going to have imaginary eigenvalues of this weight matrix, such that when you're visualizing the hidden state space, you can see that there's rotations in that space. So that's helpful and valuable because what it means is that you're not compressing or expanding, but rotation inherently will retain distances over long periods of time. So that leads to stable information propagation, which of course can be useful, especially for very long sequences. There's another approach that we can take here. I won't spend too long on this because I know I don't want to go too math heavy, but I just want to give an idea of another approach that can be taken here. Is an example would be called non-normal RNNs, where it says V here, but in this paper that's the equivalent of the W that we've been using. It enforces that this weight matrix has what we call a Schur form, so that it is a lower triangular matrix that has fixed values that can that enforce a certain type of dynamics that might pop up, and perhaps make it sort of indicate how you might have short-term versus long-term weights associated to each other. So this D here, the gray, is indicating sort of how things are associated with themselves in a short with like a in its own step, you could say. And then this alpha is sort of how you have a one-step dependence, and then beta is sort of how you have those longer step dependencies. So this gives a lot more flexibility to what we call like the expressiveness of the network. So it's not as prescriptive in saying that it's definitely has to be this form where it's purely rotational, but it could fall into a rotational form. Notably, it does give that ability to sort of learn the parameters that would give the expressiveness needed with more flexibility to learn the task. So given I've outlined this framework for sort of dynamics-oriented approaches to improving the stability of networks, I want to give a bit more background and understanding of how RNNs can be interpreted as what we call dynamical systems, which is an important and valuable tool in some branches of mathematics. So I'll give quick, I realize this might be a little bit more math heavy than things in the past, but I hope that this might give some valuable background to everyone to understand why this framework can be helpful. So dynamical systems is a framework in mathematics, in a field of mathematics, which is based on the idea that nonlinear systems can be very complicated to analyze explicitly and not necessarily precisely, but exactly. So this is particularly true for nonlinear differential equations, whether they're ordinary differential equations or partial differential equations, but even for just general nonlinear systems, analysis of exact solutions can be very challenging. That's where dynamical systems can come into play here, because instead of concerning itself with the exact solutions of a problem, it provides a framework to understand instead the geometry or the dynamics of the solutions that would evolve by giving us some tools in our toolbox that can help us to understand that space. So first one might be like fixed point classification. You might look at some bifurcation analysis because, of course, we're looking when we're training networks, we're changing the parameters of our system. Bifurcation analysis is asking how does the geometry or how do the solutions change as a function of parameters. We might be concerned with basins of attraction. So if we have some orbit or some solution that falls within a certain space of a point, sort of where do all of those end up going? Which is also related to asymptotic behavior, which is instead of worrying about exactly what it is at each step in time, what is the long-term behavior that we might end up seeing? So that's just the overall framework of what dynamical systems sort of is attempting to accomplish within this space. One thing that can be useful to think about is if we're thinking about a dynamical system and we want to understand how nearby trajectories might end up moving relative to each other as it progresses over time. We can think about this gray trajectory here, which starts at this point here and will move along it, and then maybe two nearby points. How do these distances between these points end up evolving over time? This is a question that is sort of a canonical thing that you might ask in the framework of dynamical systems. So perhaps you would have, some sort of evolution that looks like this, where the red point ends up at the tip of this red arrow here, and the blue one is sort of rotating along the blue arrow here. But you can see that the red arrow, these two start at the same distance from each other, but are orthogonal. Their displacement from that first point is orthogonal. But the red arrow ends up expanding over that period of time, and the blue arrow ends up contracting over time. So this goes back to the kind of thing that we explored with how we're applying functions many times in a recurrent neural network, because that can indicate that ability to retain information in each of those directions. So that gets to how we understand recurrent neural networks as a form of dynamical system. So we can think of our output h of t here as being some nonlinear function of the argument that we have here that we've seen a few times now. We can think of that as this f means just some nonlinear system that takes in an input h of t minus 1 and x of t. So importantly, we have h of t is a function of h of t minus 1, as well as some external input here. This follows the form of what we call a non-autonomous discrete time dynamical system, where the state that is evolving is this h of t, and then it has inputs x of t, these external stimulus in the form of x of t. So this state variable is this h of t, and then external stimulus is x of t. So this falls cleanly into the framework established for analysis used in dynamical systems. And it's worth noting then that over the course of training, the parameters of this system, and thus the structure, the geometry of those solutions, can evolve as a result of the parameters changing. So importantly, this means that with this analytical framework, we can then apply tools in the dynamical systems toolbox to our analysis of recurrent neural networks. So for example, there's a paper that is shown here, which uses some sort of like a fixed point linearization of recurrent neural networks in order to classify and understand how they're finding their solutions. There's also work that I did during my PhD to develop the concept of understanding RNNs through how you'd measure the chaos that they encode in the system of these hidden states, and how that relates to the performance that they end up achieving. So, through this framework and through this understanding of RNNs, it actually gives us some really powerful analysis tools that can be really helpful moving forward. So I want to close out here by extending this analysis and this this analogy between RNNs and then biological neurological systems, or the brain. So similarly, as I said, for RNNs, we can actually view biological neuronal systems as also being non-autonomous dynamical systems. So once again, we can view maybe this H of T is representing like the states of the neurons. So that could be maybe their firing rate. That could be, if you're looking at a biological state, you might be looking at like the concentration of ions or action potential or whatever kind of things you might be looking at there. That's going to be some function of not only its own previous state, but now we're looking, when we look at RNNs, they're not necessarily just models of their own of a single neuron, but usually we look at high dimensional RNNs. So we might look at an entire system of neurons. So this H of T is capturing the dependence on all of the neurons being modeled directly by this RNN. And then it might have some external stimulus X of T here, which would come from neurons outside of the neurons being modeled, or perhaps from some external stimulation if you're doing like TMS. This can be helpful viewing these RNNs then as brain models, because we have valuable analogies between these neural systems, or these biological neural systems, and RNNs. So some papers, such as the one that I've shown here, make these connections that RNNs, you can have their input and output could potentially be reflective in a biological system of the behavior, or of, say, the spiking rate, or some sort of, whatever we might be measuring from the neurons themselves. But then in each of these steps, we'll have some sort of analogy that might pop up. So over the course of training, we can have our high dimensional RNN perhaps encode some value of this H of T, which has some corollary over to what our neural data is. So perhaps whereas the behavior before was being informed by this underlying neural data here. So we see the raster plot that's showing up there. We can sort of predict that, or have some analogy for that in the hidden state of our RNN. And then we can, I discussed sort of some low dimensional, or some dimensionality reduction techniques for general data in the first session here, but say for our neural data, we can perform dimensionality reduction in order to look at it in this lower dimensional space. We can do a similar thing in the RNN space, but we have a little bit more control on what it is, what we're seeing there. And importantly, in each of these steps on the left-hand side, we can play with computational hypotheses and to try and understand if we're able to emulate the behavior, as well as in some way some reasonable emulation of, say, the neural data, but we're able to change up specific aspects of how we might train the RNN, or what dynamics it might be achieving, or might be utilizing in order to achieve that performance. That gives us a lot of opportunities to try and test hypotheses for the underlying processes, because we get access to every aspect of the system here and can actually alter things directly, which of course is not an option when we're working directly with cells in the brain. So when it comes to sort of testing these hypotheses or building models of the brain using RNNs, I just have a couple papers here to show examples of what has been done in that case. One hypothesis that has been tested is regarding the structure of neuron population, how those neurons are connected to each other and how they might train in order to achieve or in order to reach their performance. So, for example, in this paper that I've cited or that I've given a link to down here, we have the model structure, a few different sort of proposed structures for how it might be operating. The first one is acting as if it's just a line attractor, so it's very restrictive on the exact form that the dynamics can take here. There's another one which is a chaotic random attractor, so it effectively has no control and can't actually learn what the internal structure is here, the chaotic dynamics on the inside, but this red is indicating that it can train and understand how it's going to process, how it processes those chaotic dynamics and the output from that. And then finally, we have pretty much like a fully trainable network here where it can learn the inputs, the outputs, as well as the sort of recurrent aspect here as well. And what that generates for them is the equivalent or sort of some analogous neurons, which we'll call synthetic neurons here, which respond differently to different sort of frequencies or different frequencies of stimulation here. And then those structures or those patterns can then be compared to the actual structures, the actual patterns that are seen in real neurons collected experimentally. So this, as I was mentioning, what the RNN gives us here is testable, controllable, experimental setups that allow us to check sort of the mechanisms that might be informing what's going on at a cellular level or on a neuronal level in the brain. That, like I said, we just don't have that degree of control in real systems or in real brains. And then another way that this could be extended is not just looking at maybe how individual neurons might respond, but then how entire regions might be connected to each other, where we can treat like an entire region as an RNN, but then have it have some sort of connection to other RNNs. What that allows us to test, or what this paper tested using that setup, is how the activity of a neuron, given a particular stimulus or a particular input, could how that activity was influenced or impacted by the currents that came from each of the other areas or each of the other regions being modeled here. So instead of just getting sort of a flat one-dimensional reading, it would be a way for us to test hypotheses about what the contribution is from each of these points, which would be very challenging or arguably impossible to measure directly within that kind of system. So that's my last slide here. I will open it up to questions, but I hope that gave everyone a little bit better of an understanding of how we can use RNNs. Switch over to Zoom here in case there are any questions. Anything in chat? So I realize we don't have super heavy attendance today, so I understand if I know that was a lot of information that I covered there. But really, if anyone has questions, please don't be shy. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's a great question. For those on Zoom, so there was a question about from this slide in particular. There's uh, clearly a lot of work being done by this arrow here that just says dimensionality reduction, going from neural data to low dimensional projection of data. Um, I mean, it will depend a little bit on what you're trying to accomplish with that. I mean, this analogy here will and what you want to get from, say, the left-hand side of the RNN and how well it aligns with, say, your biological equivalent. It'll depend on what you're actually trying to accomplish with your dimensionality reduction. Um, some features might be easier to extract in the biological data, which might um, also be captured successfully in the RNN, but it's not guaranteed that something that is in the biological data will automatically be captured unless you're choosing to encourage that in the way that you train. So the method that you use and what exactly you're extracting with this dimensionality reduction, um, that can vary a lot. There's a lot of different papers that talk about, do you want to focus on the rotational aspects? Are you going to look for semantic separation? Are you just going to do, straight PCA that is, less concerned about those other constraints? But there are a lot of constraints that you can put on this dimensionality reduction. RNNs can oftentimes have a lot of flexibility to, in how they can represent data. There's just, as is true with a lot of a lot of neural networks in whatever form you're using, the flexibility is both a blessing and a curse, because flexibility means that you have the ability to choose a lot of things, but it can be hard to decide which thing to choose and what's going to make something stable versus what's going to make it just flounder around and be incapable of doing anything. So unfortunately, I don't have too much insight into the exact details of that, but fortunately, there's a lot of papers on a lot of these things, depending on your specific application, that can start getting you moving in the right direction if that's what you want to do. So great. Yeah, thank you for the question. Another one in the back here. I mean, so it depends on the scale you're talking about and what exactly you're going to provide. I mean, RNNs have the ability to recreate patterns like within like temporal data um, very effectively. And there's actually variations of RNNs called SNNs, spiking neural networks, which are often used for modeling neuronal data as well, because if you're looking at spikes, then it can be useful to look at it that way. It's a bit more of a direct parallel, a direct analogy. Um, that said, I'm not too familiar off the top of my. I mean, usually the question is not like, is there something that can't be? Because all it means is that it hasn't been yet. I'm not familiar with any type of neuronal activity that has been identified as being impossible to model using RNNs. Um, the question oftentimes with neural nets is simply, do you have the data volume to be able to train it? Do you have sort of the quality of data so that it sort of makes sense there? You might also have questions of like, uh, how do you represent, say, your external stimulus, the x of t? Like, do you want that x of t to be, the other neurons? Do you want that to be some stimulus that you've introduced? So there are definitely some modeling questions that come up in terms of what your objective is with the modeling. But like generally speaking, this framework is something that is intended to operate well for this kind of thing. I mean, you could, a lot of people talk about how neural networks were very much inspired by the structure that we saw in the brain. And the RNNs are actually the most like direct example of that. And a lot of work in the overlap between RNNs, or sorry, the overlap between AI slash neural networks and neuroscience is in the space of RNNs. So that there's usually a lot of good research for most tasks there. It's never easy. I'm just gonna double check the chat here one more time. Sure that, okay, yep, I'm not seeing anything on Zoom. So I think we'll probably wrap things up here. As usual, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out. Also, if you'd like to sort of stay updated on this, I created a Google group, which I'm trying to use as like the way that I'm making announcements. I think hopefully people still receive announcements from CIRCA Atelier, but if you want to sort of reach out to me and have discussions on there, as well as get any sort of updates that I provide, as well as the recordings to this, please feel free to reach out, and I'll try and provide the link to the Google group to CIRCA Atelier as well, so that they can provide that to everyone, so anyone can join as desired. But thanks everyone for coming today, and I look forward to seeing you guys in a couple weeks.